I want to say a few words about Parshat Balak. This is a very unusual weekly reading in that almost all of it, the action takes place outside of the Jewish people. It's about the Jewish people, but the Torah, of course, is the Torah for the Jews. We don't require the rest of the world to keep the commandments of the Torah. There are only 7, what's called mitzvot bnei Noach, the commandments for the entire humanity. And similarly, the stories of the Torah are generally not intended, or at least they don't usually concentrate on anything that happens outside of the Jewish people. Except, of course, in the book of Breshit, where most of the action takes place before the Jewish people are born. But again, from Parshat Lech Lecha, it's Avram, our ancestor, and then Parshat about Yitzchak, Yaakov. The Torah is definitely intended for the Jews. But this particular Parsha, almost the entire action takes place outside the Jewish camp. While the Jews are situated near the land of Moab, the Moabite king is afraid apparently and wants to attack us, or he maybe suspects that we may attack him, which we did not, by the way. There was a command, a divine command not to attack Moab at this time. But at any rate, he decides to be proactive, as we would call it today, and he calls a known sorcerer and person who could curse others, and his curse was at least assumed that it works. That's what he had a reputation. Reputation was that his curses work. So he hires a certain man from a different land, from Syria, from Aram, named Bilam ben Beor, in order to curse the Jewish people. And of course, Hashem does not allow him to curse the Jewish people, and instead he forces him to bless the Jewish people. And in the end, Balak does not fight with the Jews. Maybe that's the reason he didn't fight with us. Once he saw that even Bilam could not curse us, wasn't willing to curse us, maybe he assumed that Bilam had his own reasons. It's not exactly clear what Balak was thinking. Obviously, Balak was not a monotheist. And he may have thought there is a God the Jews worship, the God of Israel, but he didn't think that this is the God, the only deity that created the world. In general, a lot of ancient idolaters did accept that there is some creator too, but they didn't think that there is a possibility to come in contact with this creator of the universe. What they thought is that there are a lot of other forces that need to be worshipped, and that's the ones that actually play a role. And every nation has its own god or gods, and that's how the ancient idolatry generally developed. So it could be that for Balak, whenever he was told that the God of Israel doesn't want his people to be cursed, he didn't think that there is that there is no possibility at all to somehow get what he wants. You see, generally the idolaters in the religion, the gods usually used to be very capricious, and it's possible that at a certain time or under certain circumstances, maybe they could get the deity to comply. Or maybe he was thinking that maybe some other deity could be used in order to curse the Jewish people. Whatever the case may be, Balak definitely kept trying. And each time Bilam was telling him, no, it doesn't work. Each time Bilam was forced to come back and say the blessing instead of the curse. And the sages of the Talmud were actually considering that some of these blessings are so beautiful that they were considering to institute reciting them every day, just like we recite after Shema the passage about tzitzit. The Torah doesn't tell us to recite tzitzit every day. The Shema passages, Kriyat Shema, of course, says that we have to do it, to say those words when we go to sleep and when we get up, which the Chazal explain the exact parameters of what time we have to say the morning Shema and the evening Shema. But about the passage of tzitzit, it doesn't say anywhere that you have to repeat it every day. Only the Exodus from Egypt we have to remember all the days of our lives. And that's why this passage was added. But the entire passage was added only because of the last verse. Most likely the passage was chosen also because tzitzit kind of associates, as I mentioned in a different lesson, associates with tefillin, and it's nice to mention tzitzit every day. So they could have also instituted that we would quote Bilam every day, his blessings of the Jewish people. But in the end, they decided it's way too much, so they didn't do it. By the way, the last operations of Israel the lion that comes up, right? And the nation that comes up rises like a lion. This is taken from our Parsha. These are some of the blessings of Bilam. So, in the end of the day, the Jewish people were blessed by a known non-Jewish. Whether he was a prophet or not is a big question. I mean, certainly he had prophecies at this time. There's no question that whatever is mentioned now, Parsha, were real prophecies. Bilam rose to the level of the prophet. Some commentators say he wasn't always a prophet. Before that and after that, he was just a regular sorcerer, and he couldn't really achieve the level of prophecy. Others say that Bilam was a prophet, and in a certain sense, his prophecy is compared even to that of Moshe. So there is in fact a known midrash that when the Torah says there was no other prophet that arose similar to Moshe among the Jewish people, and they emphasize it's among the Jewish people that no similar prophet arose. All the other prophets were lower level than Moshe, but among the non-Jews there was a prophet that in some sense, at any rate, in some sense was similar to Moshe. And it was important that Moabite king and other Moabite leaders will hear from Bilam that Hashem does not want to curse us, and that whatever he said, he's not going to change his mind. Right? You cannot just find a particular time, maybe, or a particular way to get Hashem to do your bidding, the way that the idolaters think about their capricious gods. No, it doesn't work like that. Hashem does not curse the Jewish people. Whoever blesses us will be blessed. Whoever curses us will be cursed. Now, there's an interesting statement of our sages when, in the beginning, Bilam, Balak, when he sends messengers to Bilam, Balak was the king of Moab, but he also sent Midianite people with him. So the Midianites were somehow involved also. So our sages say that in fact Midianites and Moabites were enemies until now. But now, because of Jews, they kind of united. This also reminds us, these stories, they all keep repeating. I mentioned in the previous lesson with regards to Parshat Hukat, how a lot of things are so similar in the way that the Ammonite king triggered a war for no reason and started claiming that there is land that the Jews took from him. You know, those things keep repeating all the time. Now there is another similarity, right? You find that in the Arab world, the nations generally are very divided, and there is a lot of wars and a lot of terror acts between each other. I'm not even talking about just Shiites and Sunnis, but even the Sunnis themselves, all kinds of different groups and the different nationalities within. They're close enough to each other, but they're different enough to fight against each other all the time. And sometimes it's not even a difference in religion or nationality, but still somehow they fight. Lebanon has been a mess since the time that they allowed Arafat to enter, when the Jordanians threw Arafat and his gang out. So Lebanon made this huge mistake, and until then it was considered a very good and stable country, but then everybody was fighting everybody else, and even when Arafat was kicked out of Lebanon, but the fighting continued, and there was, until now is the first possibility of Lebanese to actually make some kind of a not failed government. So this is like a very, unfortunately, this is like a very common situation, that in that part of the world, everybody is fighting each other. The states that are reasonably stable is where there is one family, and that family rules the, let's say Saudis, for instance. There's one family, that family rules, and there's reasonable stability then. But other than that, everybody's fighting each other. So our sages say that Moabites and Moabites and Midianites were also enemies. But guess what? When the Jews came, all of a sudden they decided to make an alliance in order to fight the Jews. So this is how it happens. A lot of times Israel is stuck in a situation when so many different nations that really, or countries, or groups, or religious groups, or whatever it is, various types of states around Israel that are really all hate each other, but they hate Israel more. And therefore there is unfortunately constant fighting. Now, Baruch Hashem, there is at least some possibility to expand what they call the Abraham Accords. Once these people will accept us, which is the most important, the first statement is to stop denying the Jewish connection to the land of Israel, which is by the way in Quran too. Or stop denying that we are the descendants of those original Jews. We are the Jewish people, not this nation did not disappear. We're the ones who learn the Bible, who read the Hebrew, who have a day of rest on Shabbat. We're the ones who are connected to the same Jews that are mentioned in the Torah and Lehavdil in Quran, right? We're the Jewish nation, and the ones the Arabs accepted, and there are a lot of enlightened Arabs today who are accepting it, especially in the Gulf states. Quite a number of them make this statement, and they actually say to the Jews, why don't you keep emphasizing it? You came back, right? In this case, we have a lot of similarities. We have a lot of common ancestry. That's why they called it Avram Accords. It was a very smart decision. Once the Arabs will accept us, usually we call them cousins. We're not really so much brothers, we're more like cousins. Okay, we're cousins, fine. We have a lot to share. Then it's going to be good for everybody. There's no question that everybody could benefit. But it has to be done in a way that the Jews will be accepted in that part of the land, and the people who think that we're just colonizers, that we're just foreigners who came, some European colonizers, we're not European colonizers. We're the original inhabitants. In fact, we're the only people who actually live in that land since thousands of years before. Nobody else. If you look at Ammon, Moab, Edom, none of these nations exist today. Aram, Phoenicians, right, what they call the Philistines, by the way, today's so-called Palestinian people, the whole thing was invented just recently. They were always just regular Arabs. The UNRWA definition of so-called Palestinian refugee is a person who lived like less than 2 years in that place. So it's not even a permanent resident. But they claim they've been there for millions of years and stuff like that. That's complete nonsense. Right? They're regular Arabs. The Arabs conquered these lands at least 2,000 years later than the Jews already were living there. And this is all documented. There's no dispute about among the scientists. But the so-called Palestinians, who now claim to be the original inhabitants, most of whom came just within the last 100 or so years to work. Right? Once there was this infrastructure that was built, that's when a lot of the Arabs started moving there. But they were not calling themselves Palestinians. At that time, there was a place that the British used to call it Palestine, because that's how the Romans called it, in order to forget the Jewish name of this, in order to loosen the connection of the Jews to that land. They used to call it Palestine. But anyway, there was no Palestinian people. Palestinian people were the Jews. By the way, I see all the time even quotes from various scientific sources to discuss the Jerusalem Talmud. They always call it Palestinian Talmud in English, PT, Palestinian Talmud, because it's the Jews who were Palestinians. They had in their passport Palestinian. The whole thing was just invented recently, that they started calling the Arabs who happened to be in the land of Israel, some, like I said, for a few years, some for maybe a couple of generations, some for longer, but certainly not being the original people at all, that they started calling these people Palestinians. They're not Palestinians. They're just regular Arabs. They know a lot of them have last names that indicate which family they come from. At a certain point, Professor Kedar was on the radio disputing with one of the so-called Palestinians, and he asked him, where does your last name come from? And he started explaining that they come from Syria, and then all of a sudden this so-called Palestinian catches himself and starts screaming that, because he just actually revealed something that they all used to know until recently. Already the new generation might not know this, but until recently everybody knew that the so-called Palestinians are just regular Arabs, and they're using the term in order to connect themselves to the land of Israel, which was called Palestine by the Romans. But they have nothing to do with original Plishtim. Plishtim was a nation that came from the Greek Isles. But anyway, so the Arabs that now call themselves Palestinians, they don't accept the Jewish presence at all. They look at the Jews as a completely different nation, right? It's just a religion, they say. It's not true. Jewish nation has, for the most part, even physically, I'm talking about DNA level, maintained more or less. There was very few converts throughout our history in Europe and in Asian countries also, amongst Farsi Jews, very, very few converts. In fact, it was very difficult to convert. In many cases, the countries where we lived, which used to punish those who wanted to convert to Judaism, used to punish them by death penalties. So there were very few converts. But even the people who do join us, who are not from DNA level, if you could call it, they're not physically the sense of Jews. But once you join to the nation, obviously you become part of that nation. Just like the same way with the so-called Palestinians. They have, for instance, some blacks who call themselves Palestinians. Why? They're not the same DNA as the rest of the Arabs. But the point is that if they join the nation, they have their language, their culture, their religion, etc. So they become part of the nation. It's true, like every nation is like that. There's no nation that doesn't have different additions from other nations that joined it. So the point is, we're the ones who follow the original Jewish Bible and Jewish customs. And for the most part, it happened to be that 90 or so percent comes physically also. We come from our ancestors who lived in the land of Israel and who were exiled in various countries. Sephardi Jews were exiled into Asian countries. Ashkenazi Jews were ended up first in Rome and then later in Northern Europe. But we're all, for the most part, even on DNA level. It's, by the way, very easily checkable. All you have to do is send your DNA. I think that at some point National Geographic used to allow this. It costs money, but you could find out where your ancestors come from. It's very easy to check these types of things. So the Arabs who call themselves Palestinians are just like regular Arabs. Some come from Syria, some come from Jordan. Jordan, they in fact, most of the Jordanians they call themselves Palestinians in some sense, right? And then there are some who come from Egypt. But all of them, all of them used to move from place to place. Nobody lives in the same place for many generations. Especially in those times, the land of Israel was so not populated. There were so few people there altogether. There were a few Jews there, but there were few non-Jews there as well. It was just very few people in general until about 100-something years ago when the development and the infrastructure was built, and then there were a lot of jobs, and then a lot of Arabs also came to these lands. And as I said, UNRWA, the agency that deals with the so-called Palestinian refugees, they actually consider anybody who lived there for less than 2 years already to be a Palestinian refugee. Not only him, but his descendants as well. Something that's completely outrageous. Nowhere ever any UN agency considered descendants of refugees to be refugees. Refugee is a person who was actually who became a refugee. But they want to consider everybody to be refugees in order that Israel will constantly have this sore. But really, it's an injustice not just to the Israelis, it's an injustice to the Arabs themselves too. It's a terrible thing that they added them this identity of being Palestinian. No matter how many generations later they may be living in a different country, they're still called Palestinian now, and they have a so-called right to return that they're trying to get. Right? Obviously, Israel is never going to accept that, because then there's not going to be an Israeli state at all. So of all the other refugees, millions of people who were displaced around the same time period and later, they were all absorbed in other countries, and their descendants were considered regular people living in that country. Let's say Italian refugees that were thrown out of what's today Croatia, the German refugees that were thrown out of what's today parts of Russia, Poland, and Czechia and Slovakia, all kinds of areas where it used to be that there were certain people, and after World War II, they were thrown out of there, and none of their descendants are considered refugees. They were accepted in a different country, and that was the end of it. But the Palestinian refugees, they keep growing. Out of a few 100,000, there's now millions of them. And obviously, this creates this huge problem. That's why even the Israeli left, that is pro-two-state solution, so-called, they will still never, ever accept that anybody who is a descendant of a person who lived in the land of Israel for a couple of years or less, right, he'll be able to come here, come to the land of Israel with a claim that he is a descendant of that refugee. That would make it impossible for the Jews to have their state. So if the so-called Palestinians want their own state, there's a possibility for that. A lot of Israelis used to be at least pro it, and maybe they will one day again accept it. But for that, the so-called Palestinians have to accept a Jewish state. That's the minimal requirement. If they accept that there is a Jewish state next to Palestinian state, then there is a possibility. If they don't accept that, and they'll say the Jews are colonizers and they have to be all thrown out or killed, and we'll be doing October 7th again and again and again, which is what Hamas has been claiming, and which is what, by the way, if any free election will be held today in Judea and Samaria, what they call the West Bank, right, where right now the Palestinian Authority rules, which, by the way, also doesn't accept the Jewish state in any sense. But on top of it, they are not really legal. Their ruling is not really legal anyway. They haven't had an election for almost 20 years. Because everybody knows if they'll have an election, they'll elect Hamas. Most people support Hamas. And even those who don't support Hamas, they don't support Hamas not because of the methods. They think Hamas is right. The correct thing is to kill, murder, maim, rape Jews. That's all fine. The problem is that this time Hamas didn't work it out well. It wasn't successful. So a lot of people don't specifically support October 7th because of the tragedy that it brought to their people as well. But had they been successful, they'd consider it a great thing. In fact, all these demonstrations in colleges and universities in the West happened right after October 7th, even before Israel started trying to do something to get rid of Hamas. Even before any war started, the fact that Hamas was able to do this terrible atrocity, they were worse than SS, than Hitler's Nazis. They were much worse in the horrid torture that they inflicted on our people. But even before anything was done to them, already the people who support them were saying that this is the only solution. So basically, the Jews have to commit suicide. Obviously, this is not an option. So Israel will be fighting. And unfortunately, there are people who are dying, including the children. There's not so many, by the way, civilians dead in this war. It's a relatively small number. This is what people fail to realize, that in almost 2-year war, 1 out of 40 is a very tiny number. Americans or others who lead similar wars, they have much more civilians killed, especially since the civilians living in Gaza generally support Hamas. Almost all of them do, or did until recently. So the point is that with all that, Israel does treat these people as civilians and tries to minimize civilian casualties. That's why they didn't have 1 million people dead within a few weeks. That's what they could have done easily, but that's not what they did. They're trying very hard, whereas Hamas tries to maximize the number of so-called civil casualties. That's why all the centers of Hamas are under every hospital, every school, or the places where they could later claim, see, Israel is bombing a school. Who is in that school? Hamas center. Who is in that hospital? Hamas. But Israel does everything to avoid civilian casualties, try to make sure that the people from the hospital could evacuate, to do something to make sure that fewer people are killed. That's why there are so few civilian casualties after almost 2 years of war. It's a tiny number. 1 out of 40 is a very small number, because Hamas counts into these casualties even people who just die or who they themselves kill. Right now, Hamas is killing their own people all the time. It's not rumors, it's documented evidence. The Palestinians, so-called, they keep saying it themselves. Those who come, for instance, for food to the organization that Israel has created with Americans in order to distribute food outside of Hamas, so Hamas doesn't steal the aid. Those people who come to get that food, a lot of times they get killed. And the people who distribute, Hamas tries to kill them. And guess what? Every person killed is then counted as if Israel killed them. That's the huge numbers that you see. So that's the unfortunate situation. Until the world will realize that, the war will only bring more disaster on everybody. Israel didn't want that war, but unfortunately they have no choice. Doing nothing means that Hamas will keep doing it again and again, and there will be again. How many Jews are supposed to be killed next time, Chas v'shalom? Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions? How many are supposed to be killed? So obviously Israel will keep fighting for its survival, and I'm really hoping that the war will be over in a way that Hamas will have no power, and that the so-called Palestinians will at least accept the Jews as also. We're not claiming, we're not asking them to accept us as the only, but at least as also the people who live in that land. May Hashem help us all.